Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hi there, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast where things actually happen sometimes. Hey, look at that. Who would have guessed that 73 weeks into the Fires of Heaven, we finally got some plot, we finally got some action, we finally got some things happen. We did it, folks. Let's just clap it out. Clapping it out with me is Tylor. Tylor, how are you tonight?
I'm doing really well. I'd like to point out that it's week 26, and also, the Battle of Cairhien happened like 6 weeks ago. Yes, I am glad this was not a fizzle out as you had predicted, but it feels like this is a book that kind of lulls you into a little bit of a false sense of security because it blows up so much earlier you expect. You kind of don't then anticipate the second, at least in chapter 51, mini climax we get. And if you haven't read 2 chapters this week, go do that. It's a good second chapter this week. Any thoughts on kind of where we are at now? This is a much kind of different structure than we've seen, with kind of 2 hills on the roller coaster as opposed to 1. Any big picture thoughts before we start to dive into the summary and blow by blows?
I will just say more of this, right? I mean, the advantage of having your book series be 15 books long is that you can really change it up and make each one different and keep people off kilter. And so the fact that so many of the first 4 were kind of that same exact structure, and last book also kind of broke it in that not everybody came together again, right? We kept groups separate. So I think more of that, keep screwing it around. I'm giving advice to Robert Jordan in the past and looking forward to seeing what happens next. And I had been in a kind of this is an okay book, and it's got some sins it needs to get forgiven before I'm totally there, but I'm certainly feeling warmer to it this week than I have lately. So, of course, this week we are discussing 2 chapters, as Tylor just alluded to. That's Chapter 51, News Comes to Cairhien, and Chapter 52, Choices.
Cairhien, but you're getting better. I suggest then that we just dive straight into Chapter 51, News Comes to Cairhien. It's going to be a not short summary. I'm so sorry, everyone. Rand is meeting with the Lady Saland 10 days after arriving in Cairhien. She tries to get him alone, but he is more concerned by the kind of unnatural heat than he is with any interest in her. He dissuades Saland by talking about channeling and Sidene being tainted, and she immediately flees. He enters the room, and he notes that there are a number of people, both from Tyr and Cairhien, kind of the lords of the area, are arrayed, and he kind of observes them and thinks about how each of them has something that they are either keeping from him, except for one exception, which is Dobrain. He addresses him first, and Dobrain seems to confirm the troop movements that Rand has ordered, and Rand thinks that he, of all of them, is the one who keeps to his oath. At this point, Melindrha urges that they need soldiers at home rather than sending them to the south, but Rand says the Aiel are currently handling the bandits, but Melindrha pushes, saying that Andor has claimed Cairhien and lands in the west, and apparently proclamations have been made of Morghase's claim to the Sun Throne. Colliver, during all of this, has been completely silent. Rand says that Andoran claims will be dealt with with when he's ready, and then he calls out Melon specifically for thousands of soldiers who should have left days ago but have not. Rand then dismisses them, saying that he will inspect the troops tomorrow, and he expects they will all be gone. Rand then thinks of the parade of women who have been sent to him, similar to the woman at the beginning of the chapter, and he realizes that Colliver is definitely the one who is behind it, and he thinks about how both Aviendha and the Maidens of the Spear have tried to dissuade these women, but it hasn't worked. At this point, Rand advances towards Colliver and tells her that he prefers a more mature woman than the ones who he has been sending, and he invites her to join him for dinner, and he thinks that she cannot refuse. He is just too powerful. And then Rand knows that she is behind the parade of women, and he intends to stop it tonight. He worries that Colliver will actually be willing to take him up on an offer if he makes one, but then he thinks he can scare her just like he has the others, and then Rand starts absently staring at Asmodean, who very clearly is sizing him up. Moiraine, Egwene, and Aviendha enter, and Rand greets Egwene angrily. Apparently he is frustrated about the limited information that she is giving him about the rebel Aes Sedai, and Rand thinks that she is now the perfect Aes Sedai and is giving responses that give him nothing of what he needs. Rand observes that all three of the women seems closer since his argument with Egwene, and Moiraine gives him two recently arrived letters that Moiraine got because they had the seals of Tar Valon. The first is from Elida, which says that there will be an escort coming to take him to Tar Valon, and the second is a much more deferential letter from Elvieren, and Rand gives the letters to the women, although Moiraine seems to already know what they say. He says he may have doubted Moiraine if it were not for the oath, because Elvieren cast doubt on her. Excuse me. And then Rand says that he thinks that the letters suggest that there is a rift in the tower, and he notes that this means there is an Aes Sedai spy who is watching him because of how quickly the letters arrived after he got to Cairhien. Moiraine seems proud of his insight in this, and then Rand seems to wonder whether Elvieren is actually tied to Saladar, but Egwene won't say anything, and obviously he doesn't know the name Saladar. At this point, Mat enters, and Rand says that all of the men want to join Mat's Band of the Red Hand, and at this point, Moiraine starts to note all of the successes that the Band of the Red Hand has had, as well as noting its links to ancient Manetheren, and Mat very clearly has been trying to run away, but the Band of the Red Hand has been following him and finding success in battle everywhere that he has gone. He responds angrily when Moiraine tries to push him further for more details, and he says that he has news that Morghese has died. Rand thinks to himself Elaine will never forgive him, at the same time that Lews Therin thinks Ilyena will never forgive him, and he starts to feel like he is losing himself. He knows that Gabriel has been named the King of Andor, and he is aware that Ravin is Gabriel, and so he knows how dangerous this can be, and Mat reports that the Queen has not been seen in Andor in weeks. Rand reacts quite emotionally, worried what Elaine will think, and he thinks that he knew there was a Forsaken and did nothing about it, and so he thinks he is responsible. Mat's idea is that many of the people from Caemlyn will support him, but he says he is not going to do that because he needs to avenge Morghese. Egwene says that is madness, but Rand says he will not declare war on Andor. Instead, it will be a raid, and only a small number of people will go, and he asks all of the women to join him in the raid. Moiraine says that they must go tomorrow, and he realizes it is good advice, and then he dismisses them all, and Aviendha says that they will join him, and Rand says Moiraine can go, and Aviendha and Egwene more or less get very angry at him very quickly, and Moiraine says he will need guards and agrees to come, and then he is shocked that she didn't try to talk him out of this. Once the women leave the room, Mat tells Rand that this is too much going on at once, and Rand says that Mat needs to stop running. He says that he remembers how Mat got his spear in his memories, and he now has need of that knowledge. We then switch into Egwene's point of view, where Moiraine warns her to be careful, and Egwene says that of course she will, and then Moiraine says that Rand will need Egwene because Egwene is good at managing his temper, and Moiraine says that tomorrow will be difficult for all of them. Egwene then asks Aviendha to stay with her, but she says she needs to report to the Wise Ones, and Egwene says that Rand cannot know about Saladar until he is ready, but she cannot provide any assurances that the Saladar Aes Sedai will be on his side, and then she begins to worry about Rand Rand's sanity, particularly around land fear and other links to lose therein, and she tells herself to stop worrying. We then finally switch into Matt's point of view, and he is upset that Moiraine thinks him a hero, and he thinks that he doesn't have an opportunity to escape. He mocks the idea of doing exactly what Rand wants to himself, and he thinks that leading all of the armies is far beyond him. At this point, Melindrha arrives, and he asks her about ships in the area, seemingly raising her suspicion that he might leave, and then she tries to convince him to avoid following in Rand's shadows, but he mentions that Rand is going to Cairhien, and immediately her demeanor changes, and she quickly attacks him, and he kills her by instinct before he even realizes what he is doing, and then he asks her why, and it is revealed that she is a dark friend, likely spying for Samael, and Matt is distraught that he has killed a woman, and then he pieces together that exactly what she was doing and why she was with him, and then he hasn't decided what to do, so he simply stares at Melindra's bodies while trying to piece together what it is that he needs to do next. This chapter was probably not what you expected, given that your prediction 2 or 3 weeks ago was this book will end with a whimper, not a bang. What stood out to you, and what was, I think, effective here? Because there were things that were shocking in this chapter, and I think they land in part because of their brevity.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wasn't expecting. Well, you're focusing so much on what I didn't predict, but I did say that there would be a time where we'd hear about whatever the next problem would be.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the beginning of this felt like that prediction was coming true, only to then have it very clear, but we're not waiting till next book. We're going now. And so I think for me, that was the most surprising part of this, is how quickly the plot started to move now that it finally was moving. And I have some questions related to that, but on the whole, enjoyed that these characters were like, oh, there's a crisis. Let's go take care of it now. Let's not build another book, because it just felt like those were characters acting like humans, not characters acting like characters within that. And then I will say, obviously, this last confrontation thing, for me, the guy who can't remember any Aiel, this came out of nowhere. It's like, wait, what? Very shocking, very surprising. In your summary, you just skipped kind of the little piece that I thought was particularly intriguing, which is when, as I at least understood, Melindrha tries to stab Rand second time, right after as she's dying, and the knife hits the medallion and just happens to break and all this. So a continuance of this idea that everything happens just right for Matt, and that's what keeps Matt around. And so I liked all of that, though I have some questions that are not mythological, but more wait, what exactly happened and why, as it pertains to that final scene. But we'll build our way there.
We'll get there. I think that the most effective part of this chapter, the one that I'm not excited to read, but the one that I think made the rest of it work, is the fake out at the beginning of this chapter. This very much feels like it will be about politics, about setting up what's coming, and there are a few moments in here that I don't know that we need a ton of detail about, but one of the games that I'm trying to play as I'm making my way through this read-through is trying to stop reading the council scenes as just faceless heads talking at Rand and starting to pick out some of the people and the characters, and similar to how I'm trying to piece out who are all of the different Aes Sedai as people instead of just names. I'm trying to do the same thing with the Cairhien and Interan lords, and we get a couple of really interesting call-outs here. So the names that stand out to me are Celand, although she may only be here as long as Colliver keeps throwing her at Rand. We also get Dobrain, who seems to be the only one who is actually following orders. We get Marengil, who is trying to deceive Rand. And we have Colliver, who seems to be the most shrewd manipulator of them all. She stays at the background, but is clearly trying to get an in with Rand throughout it. I'm curious if any of those names kind of stood out, if any of these kind of lords are solidifying in your mind. And if not, how are these politics kind of scenes landing if it feels like Rand and a bunch of people from countries instead of really specific fleshed out characters?
Yeah, I don't care about any of those people, so I'll take the second question, which is that, I didn't hate that scene there because it felt again like this tension we've seen Robert Jordan playing with a few times, which is between being the military leader and the political leader. And so, it does end up being a fake out, as you alluded to, but it does feel to me like this naturally was the like, okay, the battle's now done. We have to arrange all these factions. We have the jockeying, It felt like a small council scene from Game of Thrones with all these different lords looking to please whoever's in charge at that particular moment. And so it all worked, but in my mind, because of how such politics works, I'm like, well, they're all just sniveling jerks, right? Like I'm not looking for a hero or somebody to relate to. It's like, well, they'll all just be jockeying and stabbing each other in the back until they get to be Rand's number 2, essentially, within that. And the fact that as a part of that, there's like, let's throw the most beautiful women we can find at him and try to control him that way adds an extra kind of gross valence to it. Yeah. But it all kind of works in that medieval courtly politics way. So it didn't stand out too much to me.
I have to say, I think the thing that stood out to me is how well Rand navigates it, right? The last time that we saw Rand dealing with court politics, he kind of had a script laid out for him by Moiraine, and that worked really well. Here, he's kind of flying on his own, and he figures out very quickly, okay, who is behind this? How can I scare the women away? And I think he does the right thing of kind of like, okay, Colliver, it's time to put up or shut up. And I'm curious going forward to see what his relationship with Colliver looks like, because she seems like the most shrewd kind of politician in this scene. But other than kind of the fun amusement of Rand scaring one lady away by talking about his madness and planning to do it to a second, and then of course my favorite moment in the chapter of him being like, well, wait, what if the cougar wants to be trapped? And then eventually realizing the madness will be enough to scare her away. It's a fun little scene. I don't know how much else there is to add to it, but I think she is the character most set up, Colliver that is, for development going forward.
Well, and I had some notes there about this kind of axe hanging over us of Rand's madness has been treated very seriously, and I think when we're in Rand's head, it often comes across a little differently. Like, we kind of understand it a lot more at times. Yeah. But in this, it felt like we were getting hints of how he's really playing with fire. He's aware that everybody thinks he's going mad, and so his temper can be a tool. And so where he's willing to scare these women for kind of a silly reason, but, something we'd ultimately say is in his best interest is to not have this kind of control and sexual politics. But because he's like so easily being like, I'll just act like a total crazy person. That's a fine line between that and then being an actual total crazy person. And I worry that in the long term, Rand is not going to really fit into that.
And I think the other thing to worry about is, I know that we are throwing around the word crazy, and in non-fantasy worlds where madness is not a thing, we should not be throwing that around willy-nilly. But for Rand, it is absolutely appropriate, right? I think the thing that really worries me is if Rand keeps telling people, hey, I'm acting this way because I'm crazy, what happens when he actually goes mad and those people think he's just acting that way still, right? Like, he is very much crying wolf in a way that could largely come back to bite him later on.
And it is primarily playing and calling wolf, but I did have in my notes that just the whole of the narration in this early section just feels unstable, right? Yeah. Like he's not fully in control, and there were those kind of weird diversions, like one sentence to the next. So I do think that it is him pretending, but Robert Jordan is also signaling to us to continue to say it's not all made up, right? There's something here.
So I don't really have anything else until Egwene, Aviendha, and Moiraine arrive. And when they do, we learn that we have missed something relatively large. Rand has learned from Egwene that there is a rebel group of Aes Sedai, and that she is in contact with them, but apparently they have had a pretty big blow-up about 6 days ago from her not giving him any more information than just that baseline. She won't say where they are, how many, whether they're planning to side with him, and he seems extremely upset at her about this. I'm curious both your thoughts on skipping that scene and also where you're at on kind of Egwene and Rand's relationship, which is very testy here, and I'm not sure it was a couple of chapters ago.
Yeah, I think it's bizarre that we skipped it in a lot of ways. I mean, not totally unsurprising because we've seen this before, that we kind of seem to skip what we think we should be there for and then spend a lot of time in scenes we don't necessarily see the purpose of. But it did feel like the whole point is just to show that this is a strained relationship, and I'm choosing my words carefully because it seems like by the end of this week's readings they are kind of thrust together more and will need to rely on each other more. And so it seems like this was the last step towards like, let's just really put a little bit of bitter life between them. And I believe it's this chapter, not the next one, but I could be wrong. But Egwene even says at one moment, like, you've come so far from the boy I met outside the inn. Yeah. And, like, I thought that was another way in which Jordan is telling us, like, you know, these two characters are very different than where they began, and where you should see that difference and know that now that they're going to be relying on each other, it's going to be much more difficult than it would have been at one time in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the really interesting thing of having these three women kind of start to get closer off screen really makes Rand's relationship with all of them a little bit messier, right? Because not only are they changing and he's changing, as you're saying, but I think that he at one point was dealing with these three people as independent kind of actors, and now they very much feel like they are working together, and that's changing Rand's dynamic with all of them, I think. And then we get two letters from the Aes Sedai. The one from Elida feels relatively straightforward. The one from Elviarin, there is all sorts of messiness, given that she is Elida's second, and there is also the dramatic irony of us knowing, but Rand and Moiraine not, that she is of the Black Aja. Right? So we've got a lot of messiness going on in these letters. What were your thoughts upon reading them and on Rand's kind of figuring out what's going on about them?
I mean, they just it was all a trap, right? Like there was no good outcome available to Rand other than essentially to do what he did and largely ignore both of them. And I guess the standout moment in that to me is that Rand told us, so that I was, I don't know that I would have caught it on my own, that all of the language used in the second letter doesn't actually contradict the first letter, right? Yeah. So Rand is able to suss out that there are no lies in there, but they are misleading statements, right? Yeah. Vowing loyalty to him, or saying, actually, they don't even do that. They say his power is so great that people must respect him. And so you get that he's supposed to be flattered, and that this letter is supposed to be read as, yes, we are the ones really on your side. But Rand himself, again, kind of like you said about the opening scene, he's showing a little bit more control and a little more savviness, and so is able to say, nope, all of this is just a tangle. I don't want any of this.
And it was really interesting to see Moiraine kind of respond to Rand's ability to read that, right? It almost felt like she was giving him a quiz at this point. She gave him no input whatsoever. It was clear she had already read the letters, she knew what the implications were, and she just wanted to check whether he could read those tea leaves as well as she did. And it's worth noting she seemed relatively impressed by him in that conversation, right? So if you're talking about how different Rand is than he was before, I don't think Moiraine lets him see those letters 2 books ago, and now he reads them and seemingly gets about the same information out of them that she does. So I think that tells us a lot about where he's at.
I did love the moment where she's like, I had to check for traps as a good Dungeons and Dragons player, where she says there were no needles in the seals and nothing in the creases or the letters or some such. It's like, that's pretty funny, because that's the kind of thing, classic D&D trap, that we all fall for.
That's the kind of thing I would absolutely do to you on a weekly basis. Yes, you are correct. I thought this update about Matt was really fun, right? He apparently is now the head of just the hottest gang of military might in the area. Everyone wants to sign up. The Band of the Red Hand is apparently modeled after an ancient Manetheren force, and we learn kind of indirectly in what I thought was a really fun scene of Moiraine kind of poking the bear repeatedly, that Matt very clearly has attempted to flee the city multiple times, and every time he does, his band catches up with him and just happens to save him from a big battle against Gabriel's forces. That's fun for how Ta'Viren is kind of playing with him over the past 10 days. What did you think about Mat in this section of the chapter?
Well, it was most striking to me that now we have 2 of our 3 main Ta'Viren are like have flags and symbols and armies assembling around them. And
3 of 3,
well,
good sir.
True. So, thinking about how these other 2 seem to be building factions in a way, I guess my hesitation there is that, like, Rand you expect it from, but that the other 2 now have gathered an army almost accidentally and become, rallying points is kind of shocking and could be great if we can just pull all these 3 under the dragon banner and go, but it doesn't feel like that's the way this is being set up or the way it would actually work. That once a group kind of swears allegiance to a symbol, they don't just switch symbols just because somebody asks them to, even if that somebody is their leader, right?
Yeah, that doesn't have any relevant to modern politics at all.
Not at all.
And no one knows when we're recording, but we have like 12 hours left, Greg.
Yeah, and then our recording gets struck from the internet.
Very likely, yes. I really liked the moment when Rand hears that Morghese has died, right? Because it is unexpected to him, and then his reaction is pure emotion as opposed to logic, which is kind of the opposite of what he's been kind of training himself to do. And B, his reaction is probably 60% Lews Therin, right? And that, I think, is interesting in and of itself. And then we also need to briefly talk about the parallel that is drawn here. If Rand is Lews Therin reborn, Elaine and Ilyena sure do have enough similarity that we might wonder whether Lews Therin's blonde wife might be reborn and tied to him once again.
Well, let me just take the step back then here. I don't know the useful place to do this. So my interpretation of this chapter, I mean, we had the POV chapter for Morghese where she like awakened from her control. Yep. She got away, right?
She did.
Yeah. So I was a little worried I was remembering that wrong, but my first reaction to all this is like, no, wait, calm down. She's not dead. Like, and Mat kind of swears she's dead, but then you mentioned it in your summary. The kind of second thought is like, well, she hasn't been seen in weeks, right?
Right.
And so as I recall, we left that character having woken up, having grabbed a couple loyal people, and then headed off kind of into seclusion to rebuild.
Exactly.
And try to take over. Okay, good that my memory is not terrible. So my first reaction was like, whoa, like let's calm down, because I don't think it was a trap, but the idea that they're running off on kind of incomplete information makes me very nervous.
Absolutely. I think that Mat's story is really about as close as you can get to seeing a body politically. But you're right. They are making the wrong choice if everything they care about is avenging Morghese, right? I do want to point out it's very clear from these chapters that Gabriel has more or less completely, or I guess Ravin, we should start calling him by his Forsaken name. He has more or less completely seized the country of Andor. So I think there is an argument to be made, even if Morghese isn't dead, what Rand is doing is still not wrong. But you're absolutely correct that he is kind of going off very emotional, clearly, entirely because of information that is not true. And I think, if nothing else, this really solidified for me how strong Rand's feelings for Elaine are in a way that I hadn't kind of expected to be.
Well, and that alludes to what you said moments ago, which is that is this Rand or is this Lews Therin? And maybe it is just that we're seeing the work of the wheel more than we're seeing the individuals. And I'm not going to go so far as to call that a plot contrivance, but it pushes things along nicely and quickly and in a moment where I thought that was really needed. So let's do it.
Yeah, and I think that Rand's reaction when Mat says, hey, let's think about this logically, is really hard, strong emotion. It's like, no, we are getting revenge. And then when Moiraine tells him, no, let's wait a day, his response is, yes, that's a good idea. And it's not so that I can become less emotional. It's almost so that I can, harden those emotions. And this is another example we've talked about before with Rand taking Avienda's advice and then missing the point of it. but I think Rand is listening to Moiraine saying, yes, calm down, and is hearing, yes, get angry in a different way.
Yeah, it made me reflect on myself when like something bad happens. It's like, how do I feel the next day? It is usually calming, but there are those things that just you stew, right? And you think about that other person, and I could see myself getting more rageful overnight, as much as the cliche is that everything will cool in the warmth of the morning sun or some such.
Yeah, anytime that I'm left alone with my thoughts, those thoughts get much stronger. Apologize before I can be angry at you overnight is really what I'm saying. Not about anything in particular, just in general. After the women leave, I actually thought that the conversation between Matt and Rand was one of the best, like, two characters who don't talk much, really kind of emptying their souls to each other, with Matt just being like, I am so overwhelmed by this, what do I do? And Rand being like, I need you, I know where you got all of this, use it for me. And I think The Wheel of Time would probably be a 5-book series if characters did this more frequently. What was your thought on that scene, and anything to say before we jump into the kind of couple shorter POVs at the end of the chapter?
Well, I thought a lot about The Rise of Skywalker, and okay. I don't often have great things to say about that movie, but one of the things that worked well for me is when Poe and Finn kind of realized that they should both be generals and that they need each other, right? And this very much felt like in that same spirit, like, we're brothers, we need each other, like, I get that you're overwhelmed, like, but let's move forward. I thought it was interesting that Rand said, I know where all this luck and everything comes from, all this stuff. And I think I'm interpreting that correct, is we're like, well, kind of, but you don't really know all of it, because some of that pre-existed the Fox people. So it does seem like Rand is again kind of acting on limited perspective on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Rand is very confident that he can tell Matt, like, I know where this is coming from. And if Matt was really honest with himself, he's like, yeah, you know, like 60% of it. But that's pretty darn good. No one else is over 20, I guess, is kind of the point that I'm making.
Well, and I got confused in the moment when he's like, because he kind of gestures at the medallion and is like, I need this. And it's like, wait, is he trying to take it? Like, does it offer him some protection that he thought? But I thought it was clarified. So to transition into the part you've already tried to transition to twice, I want to say that what I thought was effective about this is, in my head, I started singing One Day More from Les Mis, because it felt like we're just going to do like a little set of scenes with all the people marching to prepare for the battle the next day, which, we'll talk about the first of those. And then the second of those just entirely blew that up. It's like, oh, wait, like, no, this isn't just like a simple let's prepare montage. This is actually something really upsetting and crazy.
I have very little to say about the Moiraine and Egwene scene, other than Moiraine just seems so out of sorts in it, right? She is giving calm, thoughtful advice with no critique, even like in the subtext, and that doesn't seem right. And so it just feels off, and I think we get some, explanation of how and why that is later on, but here it's just eerie almost seeing her act like that. But that's the only thing that I've got in terms of comments on this scene. What were your thoughts on it?
Well, and we've alluded to Moiraine's behavior across this book many times, but I will say in my movie viewing the other night, I watched an old Alec Guinness movie called Last Holiday, and I'm going to spoil a movie from 1950, but Alec Guinness's character is told that he only has like 3 weeks to live, and he just the doctor's like, take all your money out of the bank, go on a vacation. And so its last holiday is that. And the character is constantly in these interactions, and it's got some, it's a little deeper than that, because he's kind of a poor guy, and then all the rich people respect him because he's got money. And so it's like about how good life could have been the whole time if people treated him like this. And in the end, his test results were wrong and he lives. So there's that piece too. But he was constantly doing this thing we've seen Moiraine do, where somebody would be like, oh yes, and then in the years to come, and he'd like look to the middle distance and be like, yes, the years to come. And I'm conscious that that's the mode she's been in all book, but it's like it was the kettle whistling in this one. It's like she's really making those final preparations for better or ill, because she sees the end of her pathway in her mind, at least.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. The only other small note I have is Egwene seems really worried about Rand's sanity at this point, and we haven't really seen much of that from other characters, and it's interesting to see it from the outside, even if it's only a brief moment. Either talk about that or just start talking about Matt, because boy, is that a scene.
I mean, I'm going to go to Matt. So this was just a shocking kind of end to this, and so we'll go with Greg's half-effort summary on how much he could remember from overtime. But as I recall, Matt and Melindrha kind of started hooking up, and it seemed very casual at first, but then seemed to be turning into something greater. And so the kind of big revelation of this scene coming at the tip of a dagger is that she was basically doing all of that to get closer to him and manipulate him. He believes under the control of Samael, or under the work of Samael, working for Samael?
Exactly. Yeah. It seems that her reaction when he says he's going to Camelin is more or less immediately that's not the plan. And so I think Matt surmises that the person with the plan would be Samael.
And the plan reference there would be Samael wants him to come to Tyr.
Ilion,
right?
But yeah.
Ilion to kind of spring his trap. And this goes back to that the Forsaken don't have one big coordinated plan, but are jockeying for who can capture him.
Well, we do know that a few of the Forsaken do have a big coordinated plan, and it's all of them want Rand to be attacking Ilion, right? So that was the prologue. We have 2 or 3 of them kind of working together on that. Matt is more emotional here than he is in most places, and it's mostly in him acting by instinct and then feeling bad about what he did by instinct. And for a character that is so kind of driven by these ancient memories, I thought that someone who is constantly being saved by those memories accidentally killing someone that they clearly had strong feelings for, even if it was probably the right thing to do for their own safety, that was the part of this scene that really worked for me, even more than the shock of Melindrha being a dark friend.
Yeah, and, I think if I had cared more about Melindrha, I would have found that more shocking. But, it's, again, it's my own bias that I can't really differentiate these Aiel too much from each other. And so then it's so this character I didn't really have a good beat on is evil, gets killed. I think it kept... the piece that felt icky was when he was and now I've killed a woman. Whoa! And I get it, and that's a part of fantasy, and that's a part of, the kind of honor civilization this is built on. But it did feel very silly to me at times where it's dude, it's fine. Whoever's trying to kill you, you can kill them. That's just fair.
Yeah, I always feel a little odd about Robert Jordan in that I think he is trying so hard to say interesting things about gender, and the way that he does it is by being okay, guys, there's this binary, and it's really important to how the world works. And so I'm always kind of two minds with the way that he handles gender in his writing, and I think this is exactly the problem that it creates, right? Is people doing things that are perfectly logical and going, but woman... And that's not super satisfying. Any last thoughts on this chapter before we oddly go to an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, which you shouldn't listen to until you have read the second chapter?
All right, so pause here. If you have not gone on to read chapter 52 Choices, pause us here and go do that reading. And then join us right back for a surprise ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast.
I just danced to that, and my camera is off, and I'm so mad that you didn't see it. We have today one of the covers for this book. It's worth noting we have not talked about either of those covers, so expect more ill-advised discussion sometime in the next 2 weeks. But this week, we will be discussing the cover of the ebook or the trade paperback of The Fires of Heaven. Greg should post the image on Instagram or Threads or other places that we exist. In addition, just Google the phrase ebook cover Fires of Heaven. You will find it. This is an image of Moiraine surrounded by burning documents from Hadnan Kader's exploded carriage, holding an Angriel that she apparently got from Roidion, about to tackle Lanfear. Greg, this is our first opportunity for you to say anything about what happened in this chapter, but mostly I want you to talk about the image. What did you think of this cover?
It's a pretty badass cover, right? It certainly, in a book that hasn't had a lot of action moments, I would have been kind of anxiously waiting this if this were my cover, right?
Yeah.
Presumably knowing it was Moiraine from previous covers and understanding all the symbolism going on there.
From wearing blue.
True, and the paper falling with the flame on it. I think we are actually looking at an enhanced version where somebody kind of played this up a little bit more. But it totally would have made me wonder all the book. What is this thing Moiraine is holding, and how is it going to play a part of the climax of this book?
Well, and those are really interesting questions to ponder, and they're answered in about 2 sentences of the chapter. So I'm glad we didn't ponder them for too long. I love this cover. 2 reasons really stand out. One is anytime we get a cover that features any character other than Rand, I am going to be excited by it. And the fact that we get a Moiraine call out is really exciting. She obviously is kind of in the background of the books. And so getting her as the main kind of focus of something is fantastic. And then, as you mentioned, this is book accurate. This is the reason that I vastly prefer all of the ebook covers over the traditional covers. Everything that appears here is accurate of what happened in the books and how it happened, even down to the fact that Moiraine has never used this Angriel before, and as far as we are aware, may never use it again, but it's the one that shows up in this image. I really appreciate it. It's also worth noting, if you get really close to my trade paperback, you can see that the Angriel is a person who is like forming a circle with their body, and I just love how detailed this image is. I'm just going to keep saying things about it that I like until you take over. What do you think as far as this is a cover image? Because I think the one concern of it is, as you say, the ebook covers, my worry is they are the tiniest bit spoilery, right? Why is Moiraine in an action sequence on the front of the book makes you wait for, this big moment that you otherwise wouldn't know was coming?
Yeah, I can see that certainly, but at the same time, I think it's still generic enough that I wouldn't have really been worried about it too much, because if you told me this was, just I would think about how, a lot of movies do this where they come out with a set of posters that are just kind of character portraits, and this feels a lot like one of those. And I happen to be looking at a one for A Complete Unknown sitting on my desk, and it's like that, where there was a set of posters where it was like, here's Edward Norton as Pete Seeger, and it's like, I didn't see that poster and been like, wow, that's going to be 50% of the movie is Edward Norton as Pete Seeger. I just thought there's one character from that upcoming movie. So I think it would be okay. And, especially in reprinted books, you often get like one cover of each major character so that they go together. Or, there's like a set of Harry Potter books where the spines all make a portrait of Hogwarts or something like that. So I think they can get away with it. I think it's great. I think if I saw that in the bookstore, I would be like, I want to pick that up. That looks like a good book. All of these are preferable to my generic, in the case of this book, yellow, with a zoom in on the Wheel of Time symbol.
The fact that it's not red for the Fires of Heaven makes me extremely upset. Any last thoughts on this image before a luckily much briefer than the previous summary?
No, summarize, dude. Chapter 52, Choices.
Rand is shaving and thinking about how he must be cold throughout the day rather than emotional, when Avienda, who of course is naked because Robert Jordan, says that she would not shame him in front of other men. He is confused by this, but then she eventually says she never encouraged any of the maidens to mother him in front of anyone, and when he thanks her, she says, "I will embarrass you if there are no men around, however." Avienda then asks a barrage of questions about his plan for the day while she dresses, but he doesn't really pay attention to them and instead thinks about his preparations the day before with the Aiel clan chiefs. Avienda apparently had a conversation with Colliver, who Rand forgot he had invited to his room, and Avienda more or less seems to have spanked and possibly beaten her, but nowhere that would be publicly seen. Rand worries that this will only increase the plotting and make it more subtle, and Jason Natale reports that shrieks were heard from Colliver's apartment throughout the night. As Modian asks to help against Ravin, and after he argues for it pretty persuasively, Rand eventually agrees. Rand considers taking Kalendor or going to get the access key to the powerful Sa Angriel from Ruidian, but chooses not to do either. Avienda, at this point, pinches him when he starts talking about his own power out loud, and he channels, pinching her back. Matt then arrives reporting on Melindrha, and Avienda asks why there are so few maidens around, but Rand says that he didn't do anything, and at this point, Matt says that he is coming too, and the subject is dropped. Moiraine arrives and has letters for him, one for Rand and one for Tom, and Moiraine says that he is a shepherd and he has changed so much that she barely recognizes him, and she hopes that he has changed enough, and at this point, Egwene says that she hopes he hasn't changed too much. Moiraine says that he must see something at the docks, and he agrees to go after everyone thinks that it is the right choice. Rand seems reluctant to do it, but he goes on. We then switch to Hadnan Kader's point of view, who is with his wagons near the docks, and he worries that he doesn't know who to trust, and he thinks about the note that he received, which we can now piece together was likely from Melindrha. He sees Rand's group crest the hill, and he thinks that Moiraine seems to know too much about him, and he studies them all, wondering where the maidens are, when he hears his former companion Kiel, but when he turns around it is Lanfear, and he begins reporting on all of Rand's comings and goings. We then switch to Rand's point of view, where he watches Moiraine look over the wagons, and Rand thinks that he can feel the seals of the Dark One's prison, which she sets on a wagon nearby. Rand is impatient to go, and then Kader's wagon explodes. Lanfear shouts that Rand has let another woman touch him, and at this point Lan and Moiraine charge forward, with Lan being swatted away by the power almost immediately. A number of Aiel also charge, but are engulfed in flames, and Rand weaves a dome around them so that it seems to protect everyone other than those inside of the dome. He tries to channel, but his flows are constantly being cut by Lanfear, who demands to know which one Avienda is. He says that he was never in love with Moiraine and that he belongs to Ilyena, clearly causing Lanfear to become even more enraged, and he has to remind himself over and over who he is as he keeps thinking of himself as Lews Therin. He eventually rejects her, and she attacks him even more violently, and eventually she relents, and he tries to attack, but not to kill her, and so she is able to fend off all of his attacks. He barely stops Lanfear from stilling himself, but then he struggles not to lose himself once again, and Lanfear debates how best to harm him, and he despairs, knowing that he can't make himself kill her because he thinks he will never kill a woman. We then switch to Moiraine's point of view, who first checks that Lan is still alive, and then sees that Rand is both crying and laughing, and she worries that he is mad and thinks that there is nothing he can do if he is. She identifies that Lanfear is using an Angriel, and then she takes out the Angriel from Ruidian, the one that we were just discussing in the image, and she briefly suppresses a bubble of hope and leaps forward, pushing both herself and Lanfear into the stone Terangriel doorframe that Matt had gone through in the previous book, and the world goes white. So, some stuff happened in this chapter, Greg. What stood out to you other than things literally and figuratively exploding?
Yeah, this was great. It was certainly a surprise. I thought it was the right mix of kind of a big action confrontation, but also enough kind of lingering threads that I have way more questions now that it's over. For our Zoom call tonight, my name is Greg with no spear maidens, which that to me seems to be the big question here. Like, oh, the super powerful protectors he's always had, they're just going to disappear, and I feel like that's a big question about what caused that and how we got there. And I'm certainly not saying that that's just a convenience. I think there is a reason, or there's a nefarious actor kind of taking care of that. But that I offer as the example of like, oh, there's a lot kind of going into this kind of moment. And now I think we kind of pussyfooted around it last chapter. But it's very clear that this is the moment Moiraine has been preparing for a really long time, both like on the level of training Matt, but also we get clear indications that like down to the choreography of exactly how this fell down. I would assume that means this is what she saw through one or both of those doors when she sees possible futures things.
Yes, that is correct. It's worth noting that when she went through the doorway, she got answers to 3 questions, which could have hinted at this. Most likely, this is related to her trip to Roidion, where she went through the archways in which she was able to see multiple versions of her own life. So, yeah, I think that's exactly right. If we are talking about Moiraine and what she knows and what she's preparing, I think the moment that really kind of sold that idea was how much it was clear that Rand was almost like thrown for a loop by this delay and how it changed kind of his emotions and his thinking. And that really got me wondering how much of Moiraine saying, let's wait until tomorrow, let's go to the docks at this time, kind of choreography, as you said, how much of that was about her being where she needed to be and how much of it was about her getting Rand where he needed to be. And it really kind of made me want to go back and kind of rethink a lot of the things she's been doing, because it's clear throughout this chapter, both in what she's saying and once we get into her head, how she's thinking, that she is much more concerned about Rand's position in all of this than she seems to be even with her own.
Well, and I think that raises this larger question of what I was wondering what Moiraine thinks she's accomplishing here. And so the only way I can make kind of this level of plotting make sense is that she deems this is the one way to get Lanfear off the board. And you know, so much of these the last moments feel like Sirius Black in whichever Harry Potter book that is, 5, I think. And I remember when I read that Harry Potter book and he fell through the door, I was like, great, go to wherever that door goes. Like, I totally didn't get that was supposed to be a dramatic death. And here it very much feels like the opposite, that this reads as if it's a death. We know this door cut somebody up before, right? Or some such. Yeah. But it actually to me felt much more like, see ya in 5 books, Moiraine. Like it felt to me like they were being transported somewhere much more than it felt like they were dying. And that's where I was left thinking at the end of this.
Yeah, and this is the really interesting thing, is this feels kind of like a moment where you don't see the body, and so you are not entirely convinced that it is a death, but if nothing else, this feels very like the thing that immediately came to my mind is Gandalf, right? The first time you see that movie, you're like, oh, he's dead, right? And I think it would be very easy the first time you read this to be like, oh, she's dead. And the question now is, how dead, or in what way dead, or right, especially when there is very specifically in the last paragraph the call out of she was briefly hopeful. That makes us briefly hopeful. Last thoughts on the big picture before I force us to talk about the early part of the chapter.
Well, I will just say, in that hopeful bubble would fit with my thinking that she thought this was the only way to get rid of Lanfear, and so she thought, hopefully, that like Lanfear would be the one thing that could still take down Rand, or could corrupt Rand more than, take him down, perhaps. Yeah. So she felt hopeful that she got Lanfear off the board, and we'll see how permanent that is as well.
I have nothing to add about the beginning of the chapter. I just want to note that I'm pretty sure the unnecessary nudity counter is at least in double digits, with Aviendha just being naked for no reason at the beginning of this chapter. I think that the thing to highlight from the early section of this chapter, before Rand kind of meets up with everyone and starts gathering his forces, is Aviendha seems very confident that spanking Colivare was the right solution to this problem, and I read that section and go, oh man, I think Rand has a very dangerous enemy going forward in this woman who clearly is very cutthroat, and I don't think will respond well to physical violence.
and certainly, being humiliated, right?
Yeah.
And being treated like a lesser. So yeah, that seems dangerous to me as well.
Well, in the moment that Asmodean calls out that everyone in the palace could hear her shrieks, that's the moment that I was like, oh, if this was private, maybe you have a shot. But there is no way now that everyone is aware of it. Asmodean then arrives and gives a really impassioned speech insisting that he must be allowed to help in the assault against Ravin, and I was really surprised by that. He has thus far kind of struck me as the kind of character who would prefer to stay away from any sort of battlefield, and so him demanding to go, it raises minor red flags. I'm like, is this a betrayal thing? But it also makes me wonder, like, is he actually turning the corner and maybe willing to actually go to bat for Rand?
Yeah, I had a note that just said Asmodean motivations ? Because I thought this was ambiguous and I could see it that way. But then, he's kind of being pumped up as like a henchman guy, like, not the bully in the movie, but the one of the three kids who hangs out with the bully, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like he might actually just kind of get off on the power of being there on Rand's side and showing that he's taken that side and he's protected, right? I thought that more than I really legitimately want to help this guy.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I had the same kind of read on Matt being like, I guess I'm coming, darn it. Like, that was the fun version of, I think, the same dilemma. Moiraine arrives, and she has letters for Rand, and that obviously immediately starts alarm bells ringing. I don't have much else to say about Moiraine in this section until we get the moment where she says, you're so different from the farm boy you once were. Did you have any thoughts on the early section of that conversation before we get to kind of the last couple moments of it?
Only that it's a piece with what we've been talking about. She knows she's not going to be here after they go down to the dock, so she's just putting those last pieces in place. The fact that it's a letter for Tom is intriguing, but they were always kind of allied in those very early sections, so it does make sense.
I thought you called this out, I think, in the last chapter, slightly early, but no one really cares, other than Greg and Lindsay, but they can deal with it. You called out this note that Moiraine says you were once just a farm boy and you've grown so much. And then Moiraine says, I hope you have changed enough. And Egwene's response is, I hope you haven't changed too much. And I can see where both of them are coming from, and I think they are both right. And it really kind of framed Rand's non-madness dilemma for me in a much better way than I think we had gotten at any point further, right? When Rand is kind of vacillating between what he's thinking of as hot and cold in this chapter or hard and soft in other chapters, I think that is what Moiraine and Egwene are getting at, and this felt kind of like a thesis statement for Rand going forward now that he doesn't necessarily have Moiraine to do all of the kind of advising that she has been doing thus far.
Yeah, and I think, what came to mind, and I've referenced it before on this podcast, is Galadriel's "the fellowship stands on the edge of a knife," right? Like, Rand is on a knife's edge, and he needs to have changed a lot, but not quite too much. And I thought having those characters voice it almost as kind of the angel and devil on his shoulders, but not really in that same sense, but like, the kind of whispers in his ears kind of trying to remind him that balance is necessary, I think is cool, and it was well done. Yeah,
no, I think that's correct. Any last thoughts on this section before we hop over to Hadnan Kader?
Oh boy, can't wait. No, that's all I had. But again, I would just want to underline where are the Spear Maidens and what's going on with Asmodean, because those felt to me like the big questions coming out of that section.
Absolutely. We have spent at this point probably about a book and a half thinking of Hadnan Kader and his wagons as more or less a Chekhov's gun, right? At some point, this giant pile of artifacts, something would go wrong, especially since it was a Dark Friend who was in charge of them. And it turns out the gun that Hadnan Kader sets off is not here's a bunch of powerful magical items, someone. It's, hey, Lanfear, let me tell you this information that is mostly kind of true. And I don't really have too much to say about the scene, but I thought that role was kind of interesting for what seems to be an end for that character.
Yeah, I thought that was a nice surprise. And then all I was thinking about is the discussion we had maybe 2 nights ago as we were recording, where Min said, we're bound up with him with another woman with a terrible temper. And hey, guess who has a terrible temper? I said 2 nights ago / last week that, it felt like it was, to me, Lanfear in that moment. And then we are immediately going to this terrible, terrible temper that she has.
Yeah. I thought that the early section of Rand watching Moiraine look over the wagon and then thinking about how he can feel the seals of the Dark One's prison felt almost like bizarrely early horror. Like, it felt very Stephen King to me. And it was very surprising. I think I had kind of lost track of where all the seals of the Dark One's prison were, to now know from the last chapter there are 3 left and 2 of them are in Moraine's possession. This feels very important to be like, where did those end up at the end of the chapter? And I don't think we have a definitive answer.
Yeah, and two of the 3 were at a giant explosion. It feels a little troubling.
Yeah. That aside, Lan gets a whole 2 seconds of screen time. Moiraine.
This is my boo, because I've been waiting for Lan. It's like Lan shows up, and it's like Lan charges heroically, and then it says he essentially ran into an invisible brick wall and fell down. I was like, oh, come on. Like, that's it? That's all we get? So I was not satisfied.
Question for you. Who put up that invisible brick wall? Because I think there is an argument to be made it was Moiraine.
I think it's Moiraine, right? It felt like... it is. There's a Harry Potter book where Dumbledore blocks Harry from intervening in Dumbledore's death, I believe, right? And it feels like it should be somebody else, but it was really Dumbledore making sure his sacrifice was meaningful. And the fact that Moiraine then kind of checks on Land as one of her seeming last actions just confirms that.
Absolutely. In that case, then, boy, is Lanfear mad and crazy, and Rand has a very interesting reaction to it, right? Number one, he immediately starts to fall into the Lews Therin persona. He speaks as Lews Therin. He has to fight to maintain himself. And once he does kind of finally grab control of himself, we are faced with an even more extreme version of the thing you hated in the Matt chapter, 20 minutes ago. Rand refuses to even consider killing the woman who is literally murdering him and all of his friends. So what do you make of that kind of seeming new barrier to Rand in dealing with evil women?
Come on, let's just get over it. Really, and I think, again, we've talked about this before. I think particularly because the actress was so beautiful on the show. I mean, she's described as beautiful in the book as well. But there's this kind of vibe that everybody kind of loves Lanfear, and I just find her to be so evil that I don't want anybody to give her an inch or a second's thought. Yeah. It feels to me that she's the biggest bad we've really encountered, and if you give her that little bit, she will take a lot more. So I just wanted to see him Hulk out and go, but maybe next week we'll see.
Well, then what we've got is Moiraine tackling a lady through a arch and then feeling hope, and then things go white. What are your thoughts on what at least seems for the moment to be a long, possibly permanent end for Moiraine?
I feel, my guess is that they are going to another plane, right? Like we did when we met Lanfear, right? Lanfear came from another plane when they did the stones, right? Yep. From our logo. And so we know that they could just, I think this door was into a parallel dimension, and so they are going to be stuck over there for some amount of time. I can certainly see a buddy cop picture where the 2 of them need to work together to survive, but maybe they refuse. And then I think eventually I see both of them coming back to the story. So I don't read this as a death for either of those characters.
It is worth noting on the other side of this archway, we have seen one person go through it before. That was Matt. This is where he was hung and got his spear and got his medallion. So I forget whether that's foxes or snakes, but one of the two is potentially through the arch and could cause significant issues for both of these characters. Now
I think foxes, because there's a fox on the medallion, right?
I think you're right. Yeah.
Okay, let's see what happens.
So we got 2 weeks left, y'all, and there's still some stuff to do because as our upcoming chapter titles for next week reveal, we are not done with the epicness of this chapter. We are, chapter 53, going to hear some fading words, but chapter 54, we're headed to Cairhien, and that suggests that there is more action yet to come. Greg, what do you expect now that we've had a pretty significant increase in pace and we've only got 4 chapters left in this book?
Well, I'm certainly not expecting more land. I think, I'm really curious to see where this goes. I see them going to Cairhien, obviously with that chapter title. But I actually am not positive there's going to be a confrontation there. I think they could somehow figure out what's really going on there, and maybe this is a bit of a red herring. But, when we're talking about the side of the coordinated Forsaken, Lanfear was at the heart of that coordination. So if she is now really out of the picture, they're going to be scrambling to adjust to their need to change tactics without having their leader. So, hey, that sounds like a bunch of fun things. I want to shut up and go upstairs so I can read those 2 chapters and then be really sad that I can't then read the other 2 chapters left in this book. But someday Tylor will let me, and you will join us, we hope, through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.